This ain't just a channel, this is BBTV.
Sometimes the answers we're looking for, they don't come from people we know. They come from lives we've watched from a distance. People who lived all the way through something messy and came out changed, not polished. So today's letter, it doesn't come from a famous name, but the problem, it might feel a little familiar. If you've ever looked at someone like Al Green and realized the hardest part of his story wasn't the music, it was the human part. Love, loss, faith in the moment where life forces you to decide who you're going to be after everything breaks open. And that's where we're going to start today. Welcome in.
Where we revisit the moments, lessons, and conversations that didn't quite finish themselves. Some things definitely deserve a second look. Welcome to
Boss be rising, BBTV's igniting, turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dreams, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss be rising, sky ain't even the ceiling when she hits go live, everybody feels it.
So again, welcome in. If you're here today, I'm not going to assume you came in rested or clear-headed or feeling particularly proud of how this week unfolded, because most people don't arrive at the end of a week like that. They just don't. They arrive tired in ways sleep doesn't fix, carrying conversations they didn't finish and decisions they delayed, and feelings they didn't have the energy to unpack yet. And somehow, some way, we're expected to wrap all of that up neatly just because the calendar says Friday. Hi, Patty, friend. Good to see you, honey. Oh, I love Al Green too. Let's stay together, baby girl. Let's go. You know, I love me some good, I don't know, just really good music that just gets your soul sometimes. You know, you just have those moods, right? So even though the calendar says Friday, even though real life doesn't work that way, really, real life bleeds across weeks, overlaps itself, lingers longer than we want it to, and sometimes never resolves at all. It just quiets down enough for you to keep going. That's why Circle Back Friday exists, I think, because not to grade the week or crown a winner, but, you know, to slow things down long enough to notice that what actually happened underneath the noise. Because most of the meaningful work in a life, it really doesn't happen when everything is loud. It happens in the quiet stretches that nobody applauds, nobody documents, and you know how much I am about those things. Because there's no rewards here. These are the parts where you're just trying to stay upright without losing yourself in the process. Today's conversation, I think it sits right there and in that space where life hands you a turning point without instructions, of course, where something breaks open a relationship, a belief, a version of yourself, and you realize you can't go back to who you were before it all happened. Not because you don't want to, but because you can't. And suddenly the question isn't, how do I fix this? It's, who am I now that this has changed me? That question shows up in famous lives and quiet ones, in yours and mine. And it's uncomfortable because it doesn't have a quick answer. You don't solve it in a weekend or a single decision. Lord knows we wish we could. You work it out over time through restraint and patience and learning how to sit with yourself when the noise dies down. There's something I say all the time. Pardon me. Hydrating today. There's something that I have to say all the time. I mean, all the time. Okay? that when everything is calm, that's when everything in your head goes crazy, right? And when you've got music that you can sit with and get calm with and keep the music in your head while you're doing that and stop thinking about your problems for just 1 minute, sometimes there becomes this really big moment. You get this clarity that is just unbelievable because, I mean, where did that come from, right? No clue. It was there somewhere. I didn't know that, but it was. It really was. How is that true? That's what we ask ourselves, I think. And what I say is it's true because you made it so. Plain and simple. You're responsible for yourself, for your own actions, and your choices. And when you take those moments and you take those breaks, you're choosing calm. You're choosing less stress. And I think if a lot of us choose more of that, I mean, I'm not saying, namaste or anything like that. You don't have to do yoga to calm down. Music is a good place to be. It really is. But, those choices that they don't feel dramatic while you're making them, but shape you anyway, right? A lot of people look at artists like Al Green and they think the story is about success or about talent, about music. But if you slow his life down, the real pivot wasn't professional. It was human. It was love that got complicated. Loss that cut deeper than expected, and I think that's true for a lot of people. Loss that cuts deeper than you expect. What loss doesn't? In any kind of fashion, you know? But faith that, it wasn't convenient. And the moment where life forced him to decide who he was going to be, when the applause stopped mattering. And that matters here because you don't have to be famous for that kind of reckoning to show up in your life. And you definitely don't need a spotlight for something to change you. Some of the biggest shifts happen in rooms no one else ever sees, in kitchens, late at night, in cars, before you go inside, in quiet mornings where you realize something about you isn't the same anymore. And the scale doesn't matter nearly as much as the internal impact. That's really important to me. So, we are going to do us a letter. But before I read that, let me get myself together again. Before I read it, I want to remind everyone what we do here, because we have new people come in all the time, and because Askaby is never about advice in the traditional sense, and it's never been about fixing people from the outside, okay? What we do here is read real letters from real people who are trying to make sense of their lives in real time, and we slow the moment down enough to actually hear what's being said or asked underneath those words. Now, we don't rush to solutions. We don't assign blame, and we definitely don't pretend there's a single right way through something complicated. We listen, we reflect, and we talk honesty about the human parts that don't come with clean answers. The letters that come into this space, usually they're not written when everything's falling apart. They're written when something has already happened and the writer is left standing in the aftermath, trying to understand who they are now that life doesn't look the way it used to. That's exactly where today's letter lives. The person who wrote this isn't asking for validation. What they went through was painful. Okay. They don't want that kind of validation. They already know it was. And they're not asking for permission to change either, because the door has already opened. What they're wrestling with is how to move forward. without pretending the past didn't matter. This is the kind of letter that shows up when the dust settles, just enough just to see the clearing, but not enough to feel certain. And that's a hard place to stand because there's really no momentum yet, no applause, no obvious step. There's just awareness. What makes this letter especially relatable is that while the writer isn't famous and doesn't live their life in public, the struggle itself mirrors something that we've seen play out in very visible lives like Al Green's. Not the success, okay, not the music, but the human reckoning that comes when love gets complicated. I can't express this enough. These people, they were just like you and me before they became famous, and being famous changed them too. So think about it. If they had never gotten famous, their life would be so completely different. But there are so many people out there that we can, that can lead by example. And that's how I like to do this show now. I like using music and the artist and known situations. I'm not making anything up. I research everything. These are known situations with these artists that I can relate to, and that some of my people that are writing these letters can relate to as well. That to me is a perfect, it's like saying, hey, it's okay. Famous people even have this problem, and I don't see where that can be a bad thing. I really don't. And faith stops being theoretical and starts being lived out in quiet daily choices too. So this letter isn't dramatic, it isn't extreme, and it isn't rare. It's the kind of story that unfolds quietly for a lot of people, where there's nothing that looks broken from the outside, but everything feels on the inside so different. And the question, it becomes less about what happened and more about who am I becoming because of it. So as the letter goes, I don't want you listening for surface details or comparisons, okay? It's not what we do. We're not trying to compare. We're just trying to relate. I want you to listen for the feeling beneath it, the sense of standing at a threshold you didn't plan to reach, knowing something important has shifted and realizing the next chapter won't be written by force or speed, but by attention and patience and the willingness to stay present while the meaning continues to take shape. So here's your letter.
I'm writing because I feel like my life split in two, and I don't know how to explain that to anyone without sounding dramatic or ungrateful. From the outside, things look fine, even good, and that almost makes it harder to talk about because I don't have a clean story of loss or failure to point to. What I do have is the feeling that something in me changed after a relationship fell apart in a way I never expected, and I can't go back to the version of myself that existed before it happened. I loved deeply, I trusted fully, and when it ended it didn't just hurt, it rearranged how I see myself, my choices, and what I believe about love and commitment. Since then, I've been trying to rebuild in a quieter way, turning inward instead of chasing distraction, leaning more into faith and reflection than I ever did before, but sometimes that feels isolating instead of grounding. People around me want me to move on, to get back to who I was, to be grateful for the lessons and keep it pushing, and I understand that logically, but emotionally I don't feel like the same person, and pretending otherwise feels dishonest. I'm not lost exactly, but I am different, and I don't know how to live comfortably in that difference yet. Some days I feel proud of the restraint I've learned, the patience I've developed, and the clarity I'm gaining about what really matters to me, and other days I feel lonely in it, like the world I used to belong to doesn't quite fit anymore and the next one hasn't fully formed. I'm not asking how to undo what happened or how to become someone new overnight, I'm asking how to stand in this in-between space without feeling like I'm failing at life. How do you honor what changed you without letting it harden you, and how do you keep faith when the path forward feels quieter and slower than you imagined it would be? I want to believe that this shift is leading me somewhere meaningful, but right now it mostly feels like learning how to live with a deeper awareness that I didn't ask for and don't know how to carry gracefully yet. Signed, I am just not there yet.
I think a lot of us can say that we're just not there yet. And what I hear in this letter isn't confusion about what happened. It's clarity. colliding with timing. And you know what? That's one of the hardest places a person can stand, because clarity is supposed to feel empowering, not destabilizing. Yet when it arrives before the rest of your life has caught up, it can feel isolating instead of liberating. But you're not lost and you're not failing at life. You're standing in the gap between who you were allowed to be before and the rupture, and who you are becoming now that you've seen yourself more clearly. And that gap, it feels uncomfortable because it doesn't come with applause or a script. One of the things we don't talk about enough, I think, my opinion, is how deeply love and loss can reorder a person without destroying them. How an experience can change your internal compass without leaving visible wreckage. And how that makes it harder to explain to others why you can't just go back to normal. You're describing the moment when restraint and patience and faith begin to replace urgency and intensity, not because you've given up on life, but because something inside you decided it wasn't willing to keep living on the same emotional terms anymore. You know, that's not regression either. That's maturity. Even though, you know, it often feels lonelier at first because fewer people recognize while it's happening. Okay. When people around you encourage you to move on or get back to who you were, what they really are saying is that the old version of you was familiar to them, and familiarity feels safe. I've said it before, but that doesn't mean it's sustainable for you. You don't owe anyone a performance of recovery that bypasses your internal reality. And you certainly don't owe yourself the violence of pretending that something didn't matter just because you survived it. What you're experiencing is the cost of awareness. And awareness always carries a period of disorientation, because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. Even if you wish you could, for the sake of comfort, faith in the moments like this isn't about certainty or confidence. It's about choosing to stay present, okay, with your own life instead of numbing out or rushing into a new identity just to relieve the tension of not knowing. And that kind of faith, it's quieter and less impressive to the outside world, but it's far more durable over time. You're learning how to live without the adrenaline of emotional chaos, and that can feel empty at first, because chaos, for all its pain, it gives you a sense of intensity and purpose, whereas stability requires you to sit with yourself without distraction. And that's confronting in a different way. The loneliness that you describe doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you've stepped out of a familiar emotional ecosystem, and the new one, it hasn't populated itself yet. And that's a normal phase, not a permanent condition. You're asking how to stand in this in between space without feeling like you're failing. Listen, the honest answer to that is you don't stand there by mastering it. You stand there by allowing it to exist without rushing to resolve it, by letting your life feel quieter without assuming that quiet equals stagnation. There's a difference between a life that has stalled and a life that is integrating. And that integration always feels slower because it's happening at a deeper level where metrics just don't apply. And honoring that change, or what changed, pardon me, honoring what changed you, it doesn't mean building your entire identity around the pain or the lesson. It means letting it inform your choices without letting it harden your heart. And that balance takes time, because hardness often masquerades as strength. When you're tired of being vulnerable, the fact that you're aware of that risk tells me you're already resisting it in meaningful ways, even on the days when it doesn't feel graceful. Grace, despite how it's often portrayed, rarely feels elegant in real life. It feels awkward, uneven, and really unfinished while you're living in it. And it's usually only recognized in hindsight. You're carrying a deeper awareness now. And awareness is heavy before it becomes useful because you haven't learned yet how to distribute the weight. It just needs to be distributed across your life. So it all sits in your chest and your thoughts, making everything feel more serious and more fragile and all at the same time. Over time, that awareness, it will spread to discernment, boundaries, and self-trust. But right now, it's still concentrated, and that's why it feels like too much. The question of how to keep faith when the path forward feels quieter and slower is really a question about whether you trust growth that doesn't announce itself, whether you can believe in progress that looks like steadiness instead of momentum. And that's the muscle most of us weren't taught how to use. You're not meant to carry this gracefully yet. You're meant to carry it honestly. And honesty looks like admitting that some days you feel grounded and some days you feel lonely. Some days you may trust the process and others you resent it. None of that disqualifies you from being on the right path. The world, it tends to reward visible transformation, big gestures, and dramatic reinventions. But the kind of change that you're describing is quieter and more internal. And it often leads to a life that feels truer, but less performative, which can be disorienting if you've been conditional to measure your worth by external validation. You're not behind because you're not rushing, and you're not stuck because you're not moving loudly. You're learning how to live from a deeper center. And that takes time to feel normal. If I could offer you one thing to hold on to, it would be this. You do not have to decide who you are in one moment. And you definitely don't have to explain your evolution to someone who hasn't lived inside your skin. Let yourself be without demanding. Let yourself be different without demanding that the difference make immediate sense. Let the quiet teach you what it's there for, to teach you, okay? And trust that a life built on awareness, restraint, and patience, it may look less impressive from the outside, but it will feel more inhabitable from the inside. This isn't the end of something. It's the long middle where meaning is still forming. And you're not failing because you're there. You're becoming, even if you don't have language for it yet. Okay? Language is hard and you just got to find it. Everybody has a language, a love language, an anger language, all those emotions, they're there. And everybody has that. You just have to find yours. And it's okay to not know where it is right away. That's okay. You don't have to find that one by tomorrow, okay? There's no time limit here. But you do have to do something for yourself and admit that you need to find that. First and foremost, because I think it's a big deal. To me, it's a big deal. I don't know about to y'all, but to me, that's a big deal. Okay, so now that we've gotten through the letter and I've given out my answer, we're going to move on into the next phase of this because I'm ready to talk about Mr. Al Green. I love me some Al Green, y'all. You know I do. So, in talking about Al Green today, not as a legend or a genre, but, as a human being whose life forced a reckoning that didn't come with a microphone attached. Okay. Get over there. There we go. Because when people talk about his story. They tend to flatten it into either success or salvation and skip the part where a person actually has to survive the collision between who they were and who they were becoming before the turning point, before faith became the headline. Al Green was living fast inside a world that it really rewarded intensity and attention and desire and emotional excess. And from the outside, it looked like momentum and charisma, like a man who had figured out how to move the world by sound alone. But internally, there was a volatility that didn't disappear just because the music was beautiful. And it was. We know it was. Relationships were complicated. Love was consuming. Boundaries were thin. And the same emotional openness that made the music feel intimate also made his personal life combustible. Because when you live without containment, everything feels powerful until something breaks. And something did break. Not gradually, not politely, but violently and publicly enough that it forced him to confront the fact that talent doesn't insulate you from consequence. An expression, it doesn't automatically equal wisdom. What followed wasn't a neat redemption arc. It was a long period of disorientation and grief and reckoning, where the question stopped being, how do I keep this going? And became, who am I when this version of my life can't continue anymore? That's the part people rush past because it's uncomfortable to sit with the idea that transformation often begins with loss that doesn't feel noble or instructive at the time. It just feels devastating. Al Green didn't wake up one day with clarity and peace. He woke up inside a life that had exposed its own limits. And from there, he had to choose whether he would double down on what was familiar or step into something quieter and far less rewarding in the short term. Faith entered his life not as a brand or a reinvention, but as a structure, a way to contain the intensity that had once run unchecked. And that shift cost him things people don't like to talk about, including relevance and approval and the adrenaline of constant validation. When he stepped away from the path everyone expected him to stay on, he confused people, frustration, fans, and disrupted the narrative they had prepared because, well, we like our artists consistent, right? And our story's simple. But, real growth is rarely convenient for the audience. Excuse me. Yummy water. So what's important, I think, to understand is that the choice he made, it wasn't about abandoning music or denying who he had been. It was about refusing to let that version of him continue to run the show unchecked. And that kind of decision doesn't feel like winning when you're inside it. It feels like surrendering something you're very good at in exchange for something you don't yet understand. There's a deep loneliness that comes with that kind of pivot because the people who celebrated you before don't always know how to walk with you afterwards, And the new community you're stepping towards hasn't formed yet, really. So you live for a while in the in-between, misunderstood by both worlds. Sorry, still working here. So Al Green lived in that space for years, right? Balancing faith and music, identity and expectation, trying to reconcile the parts of himself that didn't disappear just because he chose a different framework to live inside of. And that's where his story becomes less about religion or genre and more about the human cost of awareness. Because Once you see the patterns that are harming you, you don't get to unsee them. And continuing on the same path starts to feel like self betrayal. What makes his story resonate decades later isn't that he found answers, it's that he was willing to show his life down or slow his life down enough to ask better questions, even when those questions didn't lead him back to the same applause. He didn't become less emotional or less expressive. He became more intentional, and intention always feels less exciting at first because it doesn't spike dopamine or demand attention. It just holds steady. So over time, Al Green found a way to integrate the parts of himself that once felt incompatible. But integration is not erasure, it's discipline. And discipline, it doesn't photograph well. It looks like restraint, patience, and long stretches of quiet commitment that don't produce any feedback, at least not instantly. And that's why so many people misunderstand or romanticize after the fact. When he returned to music later, it wasn't as the same man trying to recreate the same energy. It was as someone who had been reshaped by consequence, reflection, and faith. And that difference shows up in the tone, in the pacing, the intention behind the work, because you can hear when someone is no longer chasing themselves. You can. They don't have to sing it, they can just talk. You can hear it. And his life reminds, well, me, hopefully us, that transformation doesn't require you to destroy your past, but it does require you to stop letting it dictate your future. And that's a terrifying thing to do when your past is the reason people know your name. Al Green's story isn't about choosing faith over music or silence over sound. It's about choosing containment over chaos, depth over intensity, and longevity over immediacy. And those choices, they rarely feel glamorous. I mean, not while you're making them, at least. They feel heavy and lonely and slow, and they ask you to trust a version of yourself that hasn't proven itself yet. That's the part most people never see. The years where the new life hasn't paid off, the new identity hasn't stabilized, and the old one still calls you to, still calls to you with familiarity and ease. But you stay anyway because you know you can't survive going back. That kind of decision leaves a mark on a person, not in a way that makes them perfect or enlightened, but in a way that makes them quieter and steadier and harder to shake. That's the legacy beneath the music, the part that mirrors what so many people experience in their own lives. When something they loved deeply also cost them deeply. So Al Green's story, it matters not because it's exceptional, though it is, but because it's recognizable. Because it shows what happens when a person chooses to stop living at full emotional throttle and learns how to hold themselves with care instead of urgency. And that's not a headline moment. It's a long obedience to a life that finally fits. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So what ties this together? The letter you just heard to Al Green's story isn't fame or music or public consequence, obviously. It's the moment where momentum stops being a gift and starts being a threat. Because in both lives, there comes a point where continuing forward exactly as you've been, it feels more dangerous than, I guess, slowing down. Even though slowing down costs you things you once relied on, the letter writer isn't confused about what happened to them. They're confused about how to live honestly now that what happened has changed their internal landscape. And that confusion, pardon me, that confusion, it mirrors what happens when a person like Al Green realizes that same emotional openness and intensity that once fueled connection and creativity and, well, recognition is now destabilizing their life. In both cases, the rupture forces a reckoning not with failure, but with excess, with the realization that being fully expressive without containment eventually turns inward and starts doing damage. That's an uncomfortable truth because we're taught to associate intensity with authenticity and passion with virtue. Yet both stories show that intensity without structure can quietly hollow a person out. The letter writer describes a shift towards restraint, reflection, and faith, not as a dramatic conversion, pardon me, but as a survival instinct, a way of creating boundaries around emotions that once ran unchecked. That instinct is exactly what emerges in Al Green's life. When he confronts the limits of living at full emotional throttle, pardon me, neither story is about rejecting love, expression, or depth. They're about learning that those qualities need form in order to endure. And that, well, that lesson usually arrives after someone or something breaks because most of us don't slow down voluntarily when things are still working on the surface. Excuse me. Hydrating. It's one of those days. Yeah. 80 degrees yesterday, and now I think it's like 40 today. I don't even know. I don't care. I just know that it's awful. Thank you, Texas bipolar weather. All right. So, what's especially difficult in both cases is that the breaking point doesn't come with universal agreement. The outside world doesn't always see the urgency that the inside feels, which leaves the person at the center of the change of, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to mix my words wrong. And trying not to cough. So sorry. Okay. So just as the letterer feels out of step with people who want them to move on, bounce back, or return to a version of themselves that feels familiar and comfortable, in both cases, the pressure to perform recovery clashes with the need to integrate what has actually happened. And that clash, it creates a loneliness that it isn't about being alone, but about being unseen in the most important part of the process. This is where the idea of faith becomes less about belief and a little bit more about endurance. Because faith in moments like these isn't trusting that things will turn out well. It's trusting that slowing down, even when it costs you validation and momentum, is still the right choice. I'm going to stop here for just a second because I want to remind you this is, I'm relating to this one quite well. Okay. Especially with Al Green and his situation and everything, because my YouTube journey, if anything, let's put it out there. You know, I said before I had lost my monetization. Yes, I won it back. We're all good. So if you want to hit that membership, you go right ahead. I'd love you for it. But listen, at that moment, I was mad. I was angry. Everything just, I was doing so good. And then boom, it's gone. I'm like, wow, what did I do? When I finally figured out what it was I did, I realized, wow, that was really my mistake. And what I did was I fast tracked myself and learned how to get monetized. But I forgot to learn how to stay monetized. God said, slow down, lady. You're missing a point. And now Here I am with all of you every single day. That's a huge difference. And let me tell you, it was a huge change. And Big Jack has said to me before how he had felt, especially in that first few times, right before getting on stage, you got to catch your breath and take a deep one and let it out before you can head on through. And I totally feel that, even still now, but it's less and less. And I think that's what this is trying to say. You know, I didn't have the momentum that I had before I lost my monetization. I lost a lot when I did. And that's okay, because I needed to lose that to find it again the right way. And I think that's what the letter writer needs to understand. I think that's what their struggle is with living in the in-between mirrors, the long stretch, you know, like Al Green's life, where the new identity, it hadn't fully taken shape and the old one still had gravity. And I was sitting with Memoirs of Redneck Barbie, right? And I love that. And one of these days, I'm going to write that book. Thank you, Mama Lyons, because she's going to help me do that. And guys, it was amazing because one person gave me a nickname and I loved it and I worked with it for a while. Belinda, 2075. I broke out early. Sorry, Bandy Man. But the point I'm trying to make here is that's who I was. I was forced to slow down because I knew I wasn't going to make it any further off of no money, right? It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that when they did that, they also kind of punish you, put you in YouTube jail for a little while. So I lost a bunch of momentum, just like I have for the past 10 days. I'm sure somebody's noticed it out there. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal. I'm just in a little bit of YouTube jail. It's okay. I'm still doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And there's no strikes or anything like that. I'm just throttled. We all know what that's about. But every time something like that happens, I've decided I'm just going to stop and think about what it is that I forgot to learn. I think that's a good lesson. Because I think even for artists, and I don't think that's a fault that you didn't learn that or you passed it up. It's not a fault. It's just a missed moment. And moments like that you can go back and find that moment again, right? And you can fix it. And hey, if you're like me, when you come back twice as strong with twice as much knowledge, and you have a community that says, you know what, I'm going to come back. Like my Patty friend over there. She's always back because she likes it here. And I created this space and she likes it. Oh my gosh. So that's amazing to me. Seriously, it's amazing to me. So I'm glad that those things happened that made me slow down. I wouldn't be here right now if they had not. I mean, truthfully, I wouldn't be here right now. So, okay. I'm already getting into 45 minutes here. I'm going to go ahead and take my quick break because, guys, I need to go and get some honey tea. So enjoy this song, and there'll be an ad for you to look at afterwards, please. Be back.
She came from the quiet storms, built a fire from the ground, turned a whisper to a warning. Now her voice shakes the town. Every setback was a lesson, every doubt became a key, unlocking something bigger. That's the rise of Boss B. When the lights go low, her vision hits high. She built a whole damn network off a promise and a try. Every sunrise, every moment, she's stacking legacy. This ain't just a channel, this is BBTV. A Boss B rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's inviting. crafting stories out of heartbeats, making visions out of dreams. Got thunder in the hustle, got a voice that cuts clean. Every mic she touches turns the power unseen. So let further spin the numbers, let the views rise slow or fast. Boss beat doesn't measure wins by echoes of the past. This moment is a pivot, this season's history. Bow down to the founder of the BBTV dynasty. Boss be rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dreams, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss be rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. She's got fire in the head, it's got truth in the frame. Got a heart that won't retire and a gift you can't name. Every loop, every letter, every dream she sets free. It's the love note to the world sign. Boss beat. And the world keeps watching as the numbers climb, but she's counting all the moments, not the dollar signs. From the late night grind to the daylight scene, she's building something bigger than the algorithm's dream. Boss be rising, BBTV shining. Her story's rewriting, a legacy in real time. Boss be rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dreams, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss be rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. BBTV, where the stories breathe. BBTV, where the dreamers believe. Boss be rising, watch her take her place. This is BBTV, this is her grace.
Join Boss B for Ask a Bee Monday through Friday, 12 noon Central Standard Time and Jukebox Journey every Saturday, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time.
All right, welcome back. Let's get the rest of this show going as soon as I can get you settled. All right. So, look, what this story ultimately asks anyone listening isn't admiration or comparison. It's asking for honesty, because the moment that you recognize yourself somewhere in the overlap between the letter writer and Al Green's life, you're confronted with a quieter, more unsettling question about your own patterns. Not what you've survived, not what you've accomplished, but what you've been tolerating simply because it was familiar, rewarded, or expected. A lot of people don't change because they're unaware of what's harming them. They don't change because what's harming them is also what once gave them meaning, connection, or identity, and letting go of that feels like erasing themselves. That's why the middle phase of transformation feels so disorienting, because you're no longer willing to live the old way. but you haven't yet learned how to fully inhabit the new one. And in that space, everything feels slower, quieter, and more emotionally exposed. The temptation during this phase is to rush clarity, to force a conclusion, to label the experience so it feels manageable. But the truth is that some shifts, in a person's life don't resolve through naming them. They resolve through time, repetition, and restraint. Listening to Al Green's story alongside the letter isn't meant to suggest that everyone needs a dramatic pivot or a public reckoning. It's meant to normalize the experience of outgrowing a version of yourself that once worked, even if that version didn't look broken from the outside. Many people, they reach a point where the cost of staying the same becomes heavier than the fear of change. But that cost isn't always visible. It shows up as exhaustion and emotional volatility, loss of trust in yourself, or a persistent sense that you're performing your life instead of living it. When awareness arrives, it often doesn't feel like relief. It feels like responsibility, because once you see the pattern, you're accountable to it. And continuing on as if you didn't notice starts to feel like self betrayal. That's why the listener may feel unsettled hearing this story, because it invites you to examine where momentum in your life might be carrying you somewhere you no longer want to go. And you know what? Whether slowing down feels scary because it threatens your image or because it threatens your sense of safety, no. Slowness is often misinterpreted as failure in a culture that rewards immediacy. But in reality, slowness is sometimes the only speed that allows you to stay intact, because moving too fast can prevent you from noticing what you're actually carrying forward with you. One of the most important lessons in both the letter and Al Green's life, I think, is that discipline doesn't kill depth, it preserves it. And restraint isn't the enemy of passion. It's what allows passion to endure without consuming the person who holds it. Now, for listeners, this can be uncomfortable to sit with, especially if you've been rewarded for intensity, responsiveness, or emotional availability, because those traits often feel like virtues until they're left unchecked long enough to cause harm. So pardon me, the invitation here isn't, it's not to shut yourself down or become smaller. It's to become more contained, to learn how to hold your emotions, talents, and desires with intention instead of letting them dictate your life through impulse alone. Many people mistake containment for repression, but containment, it's what makes depth sustainable, and sustainability rarely looks impressive in the moment. It looks repetitive and quiet and sometimes boring from the outside. That's why this phase of growth can feel lonely, because fewer people recognize or celebrate it. And the ones who benefited from your old patterns may even resist it and possibly resent it. And consciously or not, listening to this story may bring up grief, not just for what you lost, but for the version of yourself that was once rewarded for ways of being that no longer serve you. And that grief deserves space instead of dismissal. Integration requires mourning as much as it requires commitment, because you're not just gaining something new, you're releasing something that once felt like home. This is where faith, in whatever form it takes for you, becomes less about belief and more about trust and process. Trust that a quieter, steadier life can still be meaningful, even if it doesn't produce the same external feedback. Faith, in this sense, isn't passive, it's active patience, the willingness to stay present with uncertainty instead of filling it with noise, validation, or distraction. So, for the listener, the question isn't whether you should change, it's whether you're willing to give yourself the time and grace required to change without rushing to perform the outcome. Al Green's life shows that transformation doesn't exempt you from longing for what you left behind. And the letter that shows that awareness doesn't automatically make life easier, it makes it truer. And truth often comes with a period of discomfort before it settles into peace. If you're feeling unsettled listening to this, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means something in you recognizes the territory. It recognizes the cost of staying the same. And it really recognizes the risk of becoming different. The work at this stage isn't to decide everything, it's to listen more carefully to yourself, to notice where your energy goes and where your body tightens, where your spirit feels depleted, and to treat those signals as information instead of inconveniences. Becoming a different person doesn't require dramatic gestures. It requires repeated ordinary choices to slow down, to tell the truth to yourself, and to accept that meaning unfolds at a human pace, not a cultural one. This segment isn't meant to resolve anything for you, okay? For anyone. It's meant to give you permission to remain in process without judging yourself for not having arrived yet. Because the long middle is where most lives are actually lived. And learning how to inhabit it is with honesty and restraint and patience is one of the most meaningful forms of growth that there is, in my opinion, of course. But I believe it wholeheartedly. So what makes this the hardest part of stories like these is that there is no clean ending, no moment where everything clicks into place. And you can finally say, this is who I am now. And this is what it all meant. Because real integration doesn't arrive like a revelation. It arrives like a habit. The letter writer wants to know how to carry what changed them without becoming hardened by it. And Al Green's life offers a quiet answer to that question, I think. Through what it looks like to live forward without demanding certainty first, neither of them reached a point where the past step stopped mattering. Here we go again, pardon me. They reached a point where the past stopped running the show. And that distinction matters more than we often realize. A lot of people believe healing means no longer feeling the weight of what happened. That's not true. But what it usually means is learning how to distribute that weight so it doesn't sit entirely on your chest anymore. Learning how to let it inform you instead of immobilize you. Al Green didn't erase the parts of himself that once led him into chaos. He learned how to hold them inside a different structure. And that structure wasn't glamorous. It was repetitive, disciplined, and deeply uninteresting to anyone looking for spectacle. That's the part most people don't want to hear, because we're drawn to stories of transformation that look decisive and complete, when most real change looks incremental and unfinished while you're living it. The letter writer is afraid that this quieter life means they're losing something essential. But what they're actually losing is the illusion that intensity equals meaning. And that illusion is expensive to maintain over time. Meaning doesn't disappear when life slows down. It relocates. It moves into smaller choices, into how you treat yourself when no one is watching, into the boundaries you keep even when it would be easier to break them. This is where a lot of people get restless and try to manufacture movement just to reassure themselves that they're still alive. But Al Green's story reminds us that staying put for a season can be an act of courage when everything in you wants to escape discomfort. The listener might be tempted to ask how long this phase lasts. All I can tell you, honey, is when it ends or whenever what comes next happens. But those questions assume that life moves in chapters that close cleanly. No. When in reality, most chapters, they bleed into each other, overlapping and reshaping one another over time. What eventually changes isn't the presence of uncertainty, it's your relationship to it. Because you stop treating uncertainty as a threat and start treating it as a condition of being human. The writer is learning how to live with a deeper awareness that it doesn't offer instant relief. And Al Green lived with that same awareness for years before it settled into something that felt like peace. Peace, in this sense, isn't the absence of tension. It's the ability to hold tension without letting it define you. And that's a skill developed slowly through repetition and restraint. Lots and lots of restraint, let me tell you. But so what often gets missed in stories, okay, like this one, is how much grief is involved in becoming a different person. Not just grief for what was lost, but grief for who you are, who you were, and who you allowed yourself to be when you didn't know better. When the world felt simpler, even if it was more volatile. Letting go of that version of yourself is a kind of mourning. And mourning doesn't move on a schedule. It resurfaces unexpectedly, even years later when something familiar calls out to you. Al Green didn't stop being who he was. He stopped letting that version of himself operate without accountability. And that accountability didn't come from outside pressure. It came from internal alignment, from realizing that living out of integrity mattered more than being adored. The letter writer is on the same path, whether they realize it yet or not. Learning how to live in a way that feels honest, even when it doesn't feel rewarded. This is where trust becomes essential. Not trust that everything will work out perfectly, but trust that living in alignment with your values will make your life more inhabitable, even if it doesn't make it more impressive. Over time, something subtle happens to people inside who commit to this kind of integration. They become harder to rush, harder to manipulate, and less reactive to external pressure. Not because they've shut down, but because they've learned where their center is. That steadiness is often mistaken for distance or detachment, but it's actually presence without urgency, and it allows a person to engage with life more intentionally instead of being pulled along by it. Al Green's later work carries that quality, not louder, not flashier, steadier. And the same steadiness is beginning to form in the letter writer. I see it. I think you probably can too. Even if it doesn't feel comfortable yet, the discomfort is part of the recalibration, part of learning how to live without the highs and lows that once defined you. And that learning takes time because your nervous system has to catch up with your values. For listeners, this segment is an invitation to stop asking when things will make sense and start noticing how they're changing in ways that they don't announce themselves, in how you respond instead of react. I always say it, don't react. Don't react. Respond, don't react. In how you pause instead of push. In how you choose containment over chaos, even when chaos feels familiar. There's a kind of quiet dignity that emerges from this way of living, not because life becomes easier, but because you become more trustworthy to yourself. And that's huge, right? That's huge. So, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to find something real quick and trying to talk at the same time. Let's see. Almost there. Okay. But okay. So Al didn't arrive at a final version of himself, and the letter writer won't either. But both demonstrate what it looks like to live forward with intention instead of impulse, with patience instead of performance, and with faith that doesn't demand immediate proof. The resolution in stories like these isn't a conclusion, it's a commitment to keep choosing awareness over denial, containment over excess, and honesty over convenience, even when those choices don't pay off right away. That kind of life doesn't produce dramatic endings. It produces longevity and depth and a sense of internal coherence that can't be faked. And while that may not satisfy the part of us that wants closure, it does satisfy the deeper need to live a life that feels true, even when it's unfolding. So, I think we can see ourselves in Al Green's story too. Maybe not the fandom and all that stuff, but more or less the fact that he is human, People like that we don't think are human. I mean, how can they be and be that good, right? But they are. And before they were famous, they were just as human as we were. Are. Still are, I guess. I like Al Green's story because it's genuine and it relates to more than just me. I think it relates to a lot of people out there. And I really believe that, there's somebody out there that's going to see this and think, wow, that's familiar. And there's that word again. So, not too bad, right? That was a pretty good story about Al Green. So, I am going to go ahead and get ready to close this one out. I have a few things I want to share with you before I do. So, if you don't mind, watch these real quick and I shall return momentarily.
Roll on. I want to take a second to shout out Tuber Chat, because once again they showed up and held space the way real community does. This channel isn't about noise or numbers chasing, it's about consistency, respect, and actually supporting creators without strings attached. That matters more than people realize. If you're looking for a place that lifts voices instead of talking over them, Tuber Chat is that lane. I appreciate the time, the encouragement, and the steady presence more than I can properly wrap into words. So much love to the Tuber Chat crew for doing what you do and doing it the right way.
Enjoying this show, subscribing is the easiest way to support what's being built here on BBTV. You'll see the join button right next to subscribe. No pressure, no expectations, just an option for people who want to support the channel in a real way. We're live weekdays at 12 p.m. Central, and each day has its own focus. Same honesty, same voice, just different conversations depending on the day. And if you've got a story you want to share, send it in. Anonymous is always fine.
All right. So as I close this one out today, I just don't want to rush past what we just sat with. Okay. Because stories like this, they don't ask for applause or agreement. Not at all. They ask for honesty, and honesty takes a moment to settle in your body. If something in today's conversation felt familiar, uncomfortable, or quietly affirming, that's not coincidence, okay? That's recognition. And recognition is often the first signal that something in you is already changing. even if you don't know what to do with it yet. There's no assignment to take you from this, okay? No decision you have to make before the day ends, and no pressure to translate awareness into actions immediately, because the kind of growth that we talked about today, it doesn't respond well to force. It responds to attention and patience and time. If you're leaving this hour still unsure, still reflective, still in the middle of something that hasn't resolved, that doesn't mean the conversation failed. It means it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Life doesn't hand us clean endings very often, you know? And Ask a Bee isn't here to manufacture them. It's here to remind you that being in process isn't a flaw. It's a condition of being human. Wherever you're at today, whether you feel steadier than you did an hour ago or simply more aware of the questions that you're carrying, let that be enough for now. You don't have to explain your growth to anyone else. And you definitely don't have to rush yourself into clarity just to feel productive. Sometimes the most meaningful things that you can do is sit with what's true and let it continue unfolding at its own pace. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening deeply and for allowing space for conversations that don't wrap themselves up neatly, because those are often the ones that stay with us the longest. We'll circle back again. And until then, take care of yourself gently and honestly. Okay. I'll see y'all tomorrow night for Jukebox Journey. Love you. Bye bye.